Hello everyone and welcome back. In the Vampire Chronicles, Akasha is known as the Queen of the Damned, but the title of Queen wasn't actually given lightly. She was actually a legit queen, the Queen of Kemet, which is modern day Egypt, alongside her husband King Enkil. Despite Akasha being the first vampire to ever exist, Enkil was the first vampire ever created, and that's who we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at Enkil's story. Now, I've always found that he falls through the cracks throughout the Queen of the Damned, completely overshadowed by Akasha, which is expected but also quite ironic. Ironic because she began as his queen and answered to him, before he then eventually answered to her as a consort. So let's go back to the beginning and go through Enkil's life. Enkil first existed over 6,000 years ago. He was from a time when there was no pyramids, no mummies, and Egypt was known as the Kingdom of Kemet. King Enkil had just come to power and he needed a queen. Akasha was his chosen suitor and travelled from her own ancient city of Uruk, now modern day Iraq, to become his bride. It's noteworthy to mention that she would not have been ever considered for a queen if Enkil had a sister to marry, as was the custom to keep the bloodline pure and have no other challenge to the throne, in addition to the fact that Akasha was considered a foreigner. At first, Akasha and Enkil were beloved rulers. They wanted to do good, and their first unified decision was to guide their people away from the act of cannibalism and instead turn to farming. This resonated extremely well with their people, as while cannibalism was becoming outdated, they were the first rulers to enforce the restrictions on consuming human flesh. However, despite the majority in favour of banning cannibalism, ancient tribes who had practiced ritual cannibalism for funerals were outraged that their traditions had now been eradicated. The new king then issued a decree that dead bodies must now be offered to the earth and wrapped in linens before being placed in tombs. Once again, this caused a stir in the minorities as more traditions were now being banned and replaced. After some time, however, Enkil's reasoning of the spirits of the dead would fare better with the body still intact and uneaten, and that seemed to become widely accepted. The outcome of this acceptance resulted in the practice of mummification being part of the reason why Egypt is so famous today. Eventually, Enkil built an army and embarked on conquests north and south of the land, uniting his kingdom of unrest under one goal and one regime, which ended up being greatly effective. Enkil and Akasha worshipped Osiris and Ra, amongst many other animal gods. Gods of which are widely known today from studies of ancient Egypt. Though having good intentions at the beginning of their reign, Enkil and Akasha slowly became corrupt and showed no guilt for the bloodshed spilled by Enkil's Great Militia campaign, despite trying to steer their people away from violence at the beginning. It is possible that the sheer amount of power that the king and queen had resulted in their corruption. They had both become heavily interested in spirits and desired to know more. When Akasha and Enkil had heard of the witch twins Maharet and Makar, they invited them to court in order to witness their great power for themselves. As no witch had ever left their family home since their existence, in addition to being warned in advance that the king and queen were evil and would be extremely critical should the twins' powers not meet their expectations, they refused the offer, and so the Kemetan messenger returned home alone. Furious at the twins' refusal, Enkil summons his soldiers and journeys back to the twins' village with his men, with them arriving at the same time of the twins' mother's funeral. The twins were currently in the practice of the old ways of ritual funeral cannibalism, something that was completely forbidden at this point. Initially, the sisters were actually warned by the spirits that strangers were coming a second time, but they did not see it as a threat due to the high number of peaceful visitors they had wanting to witness their powers. The soldiers, however, were not there for peace. They slaughtered everyone in the village right before the twins' eyes and arrested them for the crime of cannibalism. Enkil stepped forward, the king himself, making the journey, and advised his men not to fear the spirit's wrath, as the gods of Kemet would protect them. Maharet and Makari were then taken to Kemet against their will, despite Enkil assuring them that they were under his protection. When the party arrives at Kemet, the twins settle into their quarters before being brought to court to speak with the king and queen. Akasha, after eagerly awaiting their arrival, informs them that flesh-eating is outlawed, forbidden, that only savages practice cannibalism, and that the people of the village were shown mercy by being killed quickly. She follows up with stating that they are fortunate to be alive but for their powers. The truth is that Akasha was angered to such a point due to the girl's refusal of her initial offer, that she had the people of the village killed in order to have the girls at her mercy, something Enkil wholly and fully agreed with. Maharet's firm belief was that Akasha and Enkil wanted to shape the world in their image in order to comfort themselves. Akasha begins asking the twins question after question. How did they work their miracles? How did they look into the hearts of men? Why did they claim to talk to beings who were invisible? The king and queen were willing to pardon the twins in exchange for them fully embracing the Egyptian culture, their gods, their beliefs, and also, most importantly, to lay down their knowledge and accept Akasha and Enkil as their king and queen. Makari spoke in revolt to her, however, when she says, "You have no gods in this kingdom because there are no gods. The only invisible inhabitants of this world are spirits. They play with you between your priests and religions as they play with everyone else. Ra, Osiris, these are merely made-up names with which you flatter and court the spirits, and when it suits their purposes they give you some little sign to send you scurrying to flatter them some more." Akasha and Enkil looked on in horror at the woman who was verbally deconstructing everything she and her husband believe in. They continue to listen as Makari states she has not come here to lie. She has not come willingly at all, that the manner in which she and her sister were taken before the court is nothing short of pure evil. The twins were thrown into a cell after an outcry from the court's high priests to execute them, as had long been the custom with red-haired twins. The next morning, the twins had been brought before the king and queen once again, where Akasha began with more questions. This time, Makari summoned the spirits to prove to the king and queen that they were real and their gods were not. Akasha demanded the spirit Amel come forward and show itself, and come forward it did. Amel covered the queen in tiny cuts, and she screamed in horror. The spirit loved the taste of blood. It was a euphoric feeling, though it could only do so much without a solid form. The twins were sent back to their cell, where they were left for 3 days before being brought to the atrium for an audience with the king and queen for a third time. Enkil and Akasha decided to release the twins, but not without a public display of them being shown to be weak, being shown to be powerless. King Enkil then instructed his most trusted guard Cayman to rape each twin in order to strip them both of their honor. Amel then began haunting and tormenting the king and queen and Cayman as a result of Cayman's actions, eventually driving them all insane. As Amel continued his daily torture, the nobles who were still in favour of ritual cannibalism followed the king and queen to Cayman's home one night and fatally stabbed Akasha and Enkil multiple times, leaving them to die. As Akasha's soul leaves her body, Amel clings to it and intertwines it with his own, and enters Akasha's body, rapidly healing her and creating the first ever vampire, which explains the lust for human blood. It came from Amel's original craving for the substance. Akasha then quickly tended to a dying Enkil, cutting herself and guiding her blood into his open wounds as they healed before her. She smeared the blood everywhere, his face, his mouth. After tasting one drop of Akasha's blood, Enkil rose up and drank from his wife, becoming the second ever vampire, but the first fledgling. After they became vampires, Enkil became somewhat of a consort to Akasha. She never looked at him as her equal again, despite becoming a queen because of him. Enkil could read the minds of anyone of whom he wished. He had super strength, super speed, but an insatiable thirst for blood. His sensitivity to sunlight led him to believe that the sun god Ra had forsaken him and Akasha and wanted to punish them on every chance possible, meaning that the king and queen now could only go out at night. A war then broke out between the twins and Cayman, who had joined forces after he became a vampire, and Akasha and Enkil. Over time, mortals discovered that consuming the blood of a vampire would then turn them into one themselves, resulting in hundreds of vampires emerging over a short time. At some point during this war, Akasha and Enkil were captured and contained in diorite prison cages, diorite on par or possibly harder than granite, leaving only their heads and necks exposed. This way, they could both take victims and be easily robbed of their own ancient and most powerful blood. They were rendered incapable of escaping, defending themselves, or destroying themselves, thus taking the rest of their race with them into death. They spent centuries in this state, and in defiance of their captors, they refused to feed from victims. They kept their blood from growing very much in strength, but also robbed them of the strength needed if they were to ever escape. They became living statues, with skin that appeared the texture of marble. As Akasha and Enkil are the very first vampires, anything that happens to them will therefore affect all current vampires in existence, which means their bodies must be kept safe, kept preserved. Therefore they became those who must be kept. Over the centuries, Enkil and Akasha had many carers, none more dedicated than Marius de Romanus, who went to all efforts to ensure their safety and well-keeping. Enkil had gone so long without drinking blood that he had no will to continue existing. Knowing that due to Akasha holding the sacred core, if she died then it would result in thousands of vampires all over the world bursting into flames, he chose to remain by her side, rising from his throne every now and then should anyone threaten to take Akasha's powerful blood without permission. He was killed by Akasha herself when she needed the strength to return to power after being revitalized by Lestat's music. Guys, if you'd like to watch Akasha's life story, then you can click the card here to continue the journey.